Hello? Sorry, I thought it wasn't time to start yet, so I was having a conversation. I apologize. So hello, I'm going to talk about behavior-driven development, and specifically I'm going to talk about how to try and fit behavior-driven development into the processes of where you work. I'll be talking about, I will be mentioning these tools, Cucumber and SpecFlow, as we go through. I won't be dwelling on them, and you'll find out why I won't be dwelling on them for 100% of this presentation. But when I do get to tooling, it will be the Cucumber family of tools that I'll be talking about, not other ones like BDFi or Fit or Fitness. So I think it's best that we start off with a slide that says what BDD is. So this is what BDD is. Straightforward, clear, obvious in a lot of ways. So I'm still not sure. I'm quite a good friend of Dan North's, and I still haven't quite found out whether he said this as a joke or whether he was actually serious. But we'll come back to this. But there's some interesting things that I think is important to see. And one is that it's part of an agile methodology. So does everybody here work in an agile way? Do you think? So I'm not, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, because agile is just a way of being responsive to change. So I'm going to take us through very quickly, or at least reasonably quickly, a brief history of the universe of software development until today. So there's my slide, introducing history. This is where I would like to start. This is from the Royce paper of 1970. This is where waterfall became acceptable. So this is the slide that people didn't read. This was on page 2. The slide that was on page 1 was exactly the same, but it didn't show any of the back arrows. And so that's where waterfall really came from. If you'd read to page 2, you'd have discovered that Royce wasn't advocating waterfall. He was advocating a process where you had feedback at every step. Strangely enough, this didn't work very well. So if anyone who's at Alan Hollob's keynote on Tuesday will have heard him talk about the chaos report from Standish. And if you go back and look at some of the work from Caspar Jones from earlier even in the end of last century, you'll see that vast numbers of projects failed. And so over the years, people tried to find other ways of developing projects and developing them successfuscessfully. One of the earliest methods has almost been forgotten. It's still being championed by Tom Gilb, the inventor, and it's called EVO. And so that was probably the first lightweight methodology which he started working on in the mid-'80s. And then quite a few other ones came in. So these are the famous ones: Scrum, DSDM, Crystal from Alistair Coburn, and XP. And as you can see, these all started coming around in the 90s. This was when people were having major problems delivering software projects. And a lot of it was attributed to the fact that there's huge upfront design phase, and by the time the customer saw what you were doing, it might be months or years later, requirements would have changed, misunderstandings would have got amplified, people were unhappy. And so they were, these folks, these consultants, these generally single-person consultants, were being called in, and they were trying to bootstrap processes that were lightweight, that allowed feedback to come through quickly, allowed people to respond to feedback about this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. Just to be clear, so this is 1995 we're talking about Scrum. Scrum has a bit of a checkered past, and it then split off into 2 separate Scrums. It's almost like a rugby match now. And so we have 2 competing organizations. So if you're certified by one, you're not certified by the other. So be careful. Then these guys, who represent a lot of those methods that I showed on the previous slide, came together in 2001 and said, look, we're all doing something pretty much similar. We're in the same sort of space. And they got together in Snowbird for a skiing holiday, and at the same time came up with the Agile Manifesto. And that's where the history of these methods being called Agile started. For a lot of that weekend, they couldn't agree on anything, even which piste to go skiing on. And then they realized at the end that they had to come up with something. And the manifesto, if you've read it, is pretty thin. It just expresses some values. And then on the back page, they've got 12 principles. But it gave a framework for people to then move on and say that we are working with an agile way of working. We're working in an agile way. Agile, however, is an adjective. It's to describe how we work, what sort of properties we want our process to have. We want to be responsive. We want to be able to be flexible. It's not a noun. It's not about you must do it this way. And hence the very light nature of the Agile Manifesto. The whole point of all of these methods was to try and get feedback quickly, so that if we'd made a mistake, if we'd misunderstood something, if the business had changed its needs, we could respond to that quickly. We wanted to get things in front of the customer on a regular basis. So XP, which was started in the Chrysler C3 project in the 90s, wanted to get the customer proxy to sit with the team all week and look at things as they got delivered. Scrum talks about delivering and doing a sprint demo every 2 to 4 weeks. And other methods fall somewhere in between. But when you compare it to 6 months or a year or 2 years, 2 to 4 weeks is miraculous. And there are still organizations around the world who have adopted agile methods and specifically Scrum, and I think that being able to deliver once every 3 months and get some feedback is really quick. So, you know, it's all about just trying to accelerate that feedback and that learning cycle. At the same time, there was a really vibrant scene here in London. So Chris Matz, who was a business coach, started working with, he picked up some of the concepts from XP, which was really strong on pair programming. And as a business analyst, he started doing pair analysis and found that having 2 people talking about things was much more productive than sitting there scratching your head and then every week batching up questions and sending them off in an email and waiting for a response. Dan North at the same time was working at a lower level, trying to teach people to do test-driven development and adopt other agile practices that came from the XP family. And he discovered that it was really hard. As soon as you started saying to developers, you have to put the word test into the name of your method if you want it to be run by a unit test framework, they started thinking about it as a white box implementation-based test. They started thinking about it in a way that was that caused you to write poorly structured and hard to maintain tests. And so his first thought was he used something called, I can't remember what it's called, DocsGen or something like that, which actually pulled out the names of the methods of the tests and printed them out so you could read them as if it was documentation. And at that point, he started to encourage people to write the names of their unit test methods as sentences that could be interpreted. Unfortunately, he was using an early version of JUnit in Java before it had annotations. And so one of the limitations of JUnit back then was your methods had to have the word test in them. Otherwise, JUnit didn't realize they were a test. And so then he went on in his first version of JBehave, which was the tool that he started working on, replaced that word test with the word should. And so now you had sentences that had the word should in it. And he saw a really big change in the way developers responded to that. Because they were thinking about, well, should it do that? Should it always do that? Are there some cases where it should do something else? And so it began to move developers away from thinking about unit tests as tests and more into thinking about them as documentation of the code and a way of probing into the behavior of the code that you want to write. So here we're still back in 2002, 13 years ago. At the same time in the States, Ward Cunningham, who is one of the original Agile Manifesto signatories, and also you may have known him as the person who invented the wiki, started working on FIT, which was, as it says here, the framework for integrated tests. So this is another automation tool which was trying to put the specification of those tests into the business domain into a documentation form. Then Chris Matz moved on to work with another colleague, and he started thinking about, well, a lot of these assumptions that we get that when we go out gathering requirements, we really only find out that we were wrong about our understanding when the developers try working on it, and they then come and ask us a question which challenges the assumptions that we had when we were listening, when we were talking. So he started working with a process that he called break the model. And what that was trying to think of examples of how this requirement would actually be implemented in practice, thinking about concrete ways or examples of how it would be used, and using that to break his understanding, to challenge his assumption, to see if there are other assumptions that he needed to surface. Dan North, at the same time, was writing this JBehave tool and trying to verify behavior and getting the vocabulary together. And this is a direct descent of domain-driven design from Eric Evans and his ubiquitous language of the late 90s. Ooh. And then, as these things go, both Chris and Dan happened to be talking at the Agile Development Conference in the States and sat next to each other on the way back on the plane and chatted through what they had been doing and what they had discovered. And they decided that there was something about this word should, about writing these things as documentation, about using examples to challenge your assumptions that was really powerful. And they worked together then for a wee while on JBehave. And JBehave, well, the story that Chris Matz tells anyway is that he's a business analyst, not a developer. So he was sitting with Dan, they were talking about these high-level concepts, and Dan was trying to build a tool. And he mentioned the visitor pattern. Anyone heard of the visitor pattern? A few people. Okay. So it's one of the standard patterns that comes out of the design pattern book by the four gurus. And it's quite funky and it's quite useful in some languages, but it is quite slippery to get your head around. So Dan put that into JBehave just to demonstrate it to Chris Matz, and a big pain was paid, a large cost was paid for that. We'll hear about that later. Then around 2004, JBehave was beginning to take shape, and Chris Matz and Dan started, instead of just using the word should, they started writing their stories, as they were called in JBehave. They wrote their stories in a text file so that they could be authored and worked on by business analysts and customers and product owners, not just developers who had access to the source control. And this blog post from 2005 on Chris's blog of the time is possibly the first outing for this story format, which uses that given, when, then format, which we'll come back to in a while. In around, I think it was 2005, Uncle Bob, Robert Martin, who another signatory of the Agile Manifesto, put a web front end on top of Fit, the tool that Ward Cunningham had done, thus making the specifications, the business-readable specifications, even more accessible to the business, because now they were hosted on a web server. And so the business didn't need to use any special editors or tools. They could just go to an HTML browser and click through their specifications, see what had passed, see what had failed, and in fact, even by clicking the Run button, see all of their specifications run against a test installation. So here we're beginning to see the first sort of outing for living documentation actually in the hands of the customer, being able to see the stuff that you guys are delivering working as they've specified. Time moves on. Chris and his team of Olaf Maassen and some other contributors started thinking about other ways of working, other ways of getting feedback quickly, and other ways of trying to defer decisions until later. And the two terms that he came up with were feature injection, which is essentially about delaying putting things into the product until it's been shown that you need it, and real options, which is trying to model some of those decision makings in terms of the financial market. And so options are basically, you have a choice to do something. And the idea about an option is that it gives you some flexibility. You have to understand with options, both in software and in financial terms, when do they expire, how much cost is there to actually keep that option alive, and you only make a decision when it comes to a point where the option is either going to expire or become too expensive. So this book is it's actually a graphic novel. So I wouldn't give it to your children, but it's a quick read. There's lots of nice cartoons in it. Cucumber. So it is, the world is actually full of lots of little pieces of synchronicity. So Aslak Hellsoy happened to be working at a company called DRW. Dan North, who'd been working on JBehave, left ThoughtWorks and started contracting at DRW. They sat together. Aslak was working in Ruby. He didn't want to use JBehave in Java, so he did something similar called Cucumber, changed a few things, and suddenly we have two different paths that we're going down. We've got Cucumber, we've got JBehave for Java, we've got Fit and Fitness running in a wiki. So this was released in 2008. At that point, Gojko Adzik, who you may have come across over the past wee while, who's become a megastar in the industry, has written Jolt award-winning book, Specification by Example, started playing, he'd been playing with Fitness a lot, and he saw Cucumber getting released on the Ruby stack, and he wanted to use it in Java and on other stacks as well. So he then went off and did something really hideous to try and get a Ruby version of Cucumber running on JRuby on the JVM. It was flaky as hell, but it bootstrapped that process, and it demonstrated that there was a desire for this sort of tooling in the Java space as well. The tool that he actually created was called Cuke for Duke, which sort of sat there as a bridge between the Ruby implementation and the JVM implementation. This became popular, and it got ported to .NET, as everything does. It became Qt for Nuke, which doesn't sound very Pacific, but there you go, let's have it. And then 2009, a bundle of people in Austria and Hungary called Tech Talk said, look, this Qt for Nuke really is a bit flaky. Let's do something natively in .NET. And so they created SpecFlow. So that's pretty much brings us up to where we are today. Oh no, there's that slide as well. So here we are with, these are Goiko's books, which came out slightly later. This is a really, really excellent, foundational, informative book about why it's important that we can get business people and technical people talking together in a way that they both understand what each other is saying. And this was his Jolt award-winning book that talks about his experiences over 7 years of training large and small companies to work in a collaborative way, specifying what the product should do before they write it out. And BDD's become popular. There's now hundreds of books about it, and they all keep going around. Of course, Java is still a really important platform. How many people here are working in Java? Okay, not that many. Well, so there's lots of books out there, but if you're working in Java and you want to use Cucumber, you have to buy my book because it's the only one about Java. Okay, so that was a whirlwind history tour. It took me 16 minutes, which is good. But we've gone all the way from the mid-70s of Waterfall, through the pain that caused, through the agile revolution, as it was, to behavior-driven development and getting business people to collaborate with technical people to specify what the product should do, and writing that up in a business domain language, in a plain text file, which can then drive automated tests and report on whether your software behaves in the way that the specification describes. Now, once you get there, you get to what's called, it's got two names, executable specification, because it's specification that executes, but maybe a friendlier way of calling it is living documentation, because living documentation is very unlike any other documentation that you have in your industry, or any industry. What happens to documentation? It goes out of date, right? You go to a new place of work, and they say, yeah, there's a wiki, but most of it's wrong. Or here's some class diagrams. We've changed bits of it. People don't keep things up to date. Whereas living documentation, because when you run it, it goes green or red, depending on whether the system behaves that way, it immediately tells you it's gone out of date. Okay, that's me in history finished. Are there any questions on that at the minute? No. Okay. So I talked about Fit, I talked about Fitness, JBehave, SpecFlow, Cucumber. There's Cucumber Ruby, there's Cucumber Java, there's Bhat for PHP, there's BDD5, there's loads and loads of tools out there. And so this is an old slide that I've somewhat corrupted, but it's basically, it's about, there's an us and them culture in a lot of, in the human world, but especially in technology. So I run a computer programming club for kids. They're 14-year-olds. And two of them, who are the most advanced among them, have done a bit of programming at home. They spend most of every 2-hour session arguing about whether Java or C++ is better. Okay? And that's 14-year-olds. And we don't appear to have got any better as we got older. So it's not about what tool you use. And in fact, it's more important than that. It's not about what you call it. So BDD is what the Cucumber family of tools calls this process. Goiko talks about specification by example, or sometimes known as SBE. If you read some of the stuff that comes out of the testing community, or you read the books or blogs by Marcus Gärtner, you'll see it called acceptance test-driven development. And you've also got test-driven development, which, is that similar or not? So it's a rather large picture of another Londoner. This is Liz Keogh, who has worked very closely with Dan over a number of years, and in fact was responsible for removing the visitor pattern from JBehave, thus allowing it to be released at version 1. So she has got a wonderful blog post, and all the links are at the bottom of the slides. And the blog post basically asks the question of what is the difference between all of these different acronyms? And her answer is, they're called different things. Okay? So that's maybe a bit simplistic. I would have loved to have been at Jor's talk yesterday to find out what his answer was. because I believe he did a session in the similar space. But what Liz believes, and what I believe as well, is that they're just different names for the same thing. Now, some people then challenge, say, TDD is completely different from all the others. But actually, they're all in the same space. I'm going to try and prove that to you. So TDD, you think about what the code should do before it does it. You're writing a test before you've got the code. You're specifying how it should behave. And so this is a design process. You're designing the interface of how you're going to interact with the code you're about to build. You then write a test, which is an example that clarifies that understanding, that design. If that example is hard to write, i.e., if it's hard to write a test for the thing you're about to build, you've probably got something wrong in your design, because actually you want things to be easy to use. Things that are complicated to use, methods that have 37 parameters or need 27 dependencies injected into the constructor, that's painful to do, and that's feedback telling you it's probably a bad thing to do. So we use examples, and then as I was talking about, when Dan noticed that if you wrote your unit tests with method names that were sentences that documented the behavior that they were verifying, well, you're going to be writing these in a ubiquitous language, in the language of the domain. It should throw an exception, or it should allow me to withdraw $20 from my account. And that is very similar to what you had to do in BDD. In BDD, we work from the outside. We focus on value. We focus on something that the customer wants to be able to do with the application. We design it by thinking about that interaction. We discover the examples. This time, we're not working on our own. We're working collaboratively, and I will talk a bit more about that in a wee while. But the idea is still the same. We think about concrete examples of how people or systems will interact with our system. And we then write that up in this living documentation, the ubiquitous language, so that we can see what's been implemented, and at the press of a button, we can verify that it behaves in the way that we expect it to. So, they're different words. They're different words, but it's the same idea. It's the same process. If there's any difference between those 4 acronyms at the beginning, it's that TDD typically uses tools that are only comprehensible to developers. It makes that barrier for the consumption of the artifacts by the non-technical members, such as product owners and customers, that little bit harder. And that's why these are generally smaller tests, smaller examples around smaller behaviors, and then normally down at the implementation level. But none of this, BDD does not require tools. So TDD itself doesn't require tools either, but BDD absolutely doesn't require tools. Go back to Dan North's Dan North's maybe jokey definition of what BDD is. You'll notice that he talks about high automation. And I think this is something that, it's not this definition that has introduced this tension, but this I think is unfortunate in that it amplifies the tension between BDD as a way of collaborating and discovering examples and working out what we want our software to do, and a way of automating the specifications and that documentation once we've discovered it. So I'm going to challenge this idea that high automation is necessarily a part of BDD. First off, I'm going to go back to Liz Keogh, who states it in a way that I think is extremely useful. BDD is about having conversations, and it's those conversations where we get the most value. Okay, so think about the last time you received a 200-page requirement specification, if you ever have done. And consider how easy it was to really get inside the mind of the person who wrote it. I would contend it's really hard to understand the vision and the value of a product by reading a requirement specification. However, having a conversation, you can ask questions. What's supposed to happen in this case? How about if they do that? What if the service goes down or the latency increases? So those conversations are really important for getting a shared understanding of what the product's supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. Once you've had those conversations, as long as you're getting a good level of conversation there, maybe that's enough. If you're going to go straight away and implement it, or if you're pairing up with your analyst as you implement it, maybe that's enough. But if you're going to be maybe delaying it for a wee while, then capturing those conversations is the next most important thing, because that's a record of it. That's something that you can then go back to if you come to it in a week's time and you've slightly forgotten. You can share it with other team members and consider consider whether it still captures the requirements and captures your understanding correctly. And only once you've got good at capturing those conversations is it worth thinking about automating the conversations. Because if your conversations are poor and you spend time trying to automate them, your automation will be of low value. It will be hard to understand, it will be hard to implement, and it will be hard to maintain. And so this is a really important and very simplistic, I guess, ordering of what is important in the BDD process, or even more widely, in the software development process itself. She's got another article. You don't worry about reading this. It's a great blog post, and I'll put it up. The slides will be on the DevWeek website, and they're also on SlideShare. So don't worry about taking notes or even reading through it. But essentially, she'd start another post saying, I'm so sick and tired of going to places who say, we want to do BDD. Which tool should we use? And no, that's a wrong question. BDD, how can we get people to collaborate? How can we force the product owner to care about what the team delivers? And that's what you should get done first. If you want to work in a way that you're going to work from behaviors, where you specify collaboratively what the system should do, when you're going to get people actually working together, you need to get those conversations and those relationships working. And only then think about automating it with the tools. Because in fact, the tools are a second-order input to this process. If you just do the conversations and capture that, you'll get 70% of the value. You won't get the full enchilada, but at least now the developers will understand why they're doing things, so they may make the right assumptions when things are unclear. Or if they find something that's contentious, they'll be able to go back and ask meaningful questions, because they know what the domain does. They're no longer sort of dumb typists that are just typing out ifs and whens. So it's a great article, and as you can tell, I like it. Liz is, by the way, working on a book. It's on LeanPub. It's not finished yet, but what she's written so far is amazing. Aslak also, Aslak is the creator of Cucumber, and he also did another article much more recently, just last year, and he calls Cucumber the world's most misunderstood collaboration tool. So here he is talking about Cucumber. He's not talking about BDD without Cucumber, but he's saying that Cucumber is a tool to facilitate that communication. So it makes it worthwhile capturing the conversations in the given, when, then format, because then it is relatively trivial to automate those scenarios, as the examples are called. But it's a collaboration tool. And what he's found in his consulting work is that he goes to large numbers of organizations who say, we want to use Cucumber because we want to improve our test automation. And his observation is, again, that is a bad idea to start from the goal of having test automation. Test automation is something that falls naturally out of doing BDD well. BDD does not get done well as a result of trying to do test automation using those tools. So, BDD, what is it? It's not about the tools, it's about the collaboration. So how does it work? The process, or the way that we work through it in the Cucumber space, is characterized using this very simple slide. So there's lots more details and heuristics and advice and best practices and good practices and myths and all sorts of things that I'll talk about quite a few of them as we go through. But essentially, the idea is you come in with some sort of user story. This could be, in some organizations, it's not even user stories. They talk about requirements or features. So they come in with something that needs to be delivered. Hopefully, actually, no, as a precursor of this, the customer has had to actually think about what they want. They need to have workshopped it with their customer experience team. They need to have done some market research. They have got to have already talked to their business and their actuaries or their technical teams or their cash flow people to validate some of their assumptions. So they come in having done the analysis. So they've got the analysis done before they bring it to the rest of the team. And then they run a workshop. Now, this workshop in the BDD documentation, is called the Three Amigos workshop. But it doesn't matter what you call it. The idea is that you bring together a core group of people that have different perspectives on the art of software development. And it must contain, at a minimum, somebody representing the customer, somebody representing the development team, and somebody representing test or QA. And that's why it's called the three amigos in the BDD world. That's your minimum requirement, because those three perspectives are very different. So the customer wants to think about value, about delivering things to the end user, to the systems that need to consume something that when it's finished. The developer has an idea about the technology stack it's going to be built on, some of its limitations, some of the assumptions, some of the other bodies that are buried in the rest of the legacy code base. And the tester has had years of experience of really quite poor software, how it breaks, what might go wrong, when things might go down the tube. And that gives a very, a triangulated set of perspectives that then allows them to come up with different examples of how this feature might work. And those different examples will then challenge the understanding that the customer, the product owner, brought to the workshop, and will discover unarticulated assumptions, contradictions, paths that hadn't been thought about before, features that can be deferred until later. So this is the core meeting where those three, and maybe others, will try and explore the feature with actual concrete paths through the system using concrete data items to discover the hidden assumptions, discover things that you don't know that you need to find out, discover things that, features that have not yet been articulated. And this then causes a feedback loop, because that brings in ideas into the process. You might find that you want to split stories, defer stories, maybe you need to go off and do a spike before you can actually do any more, go any further down the development route. This feedback loop is really important. And this is where the 70% value that I was talking about comes from. This is the communication and possibly capturing that communication, that conversation. And down here, as an output, we have automated tests and the code that we're actually going to develop. I really am not trying to downplay the value of this, because that's when you've got the whole process, that's when you get the most value out of doing this work. But this is a side effect. This is a second-order benefit. And the automated tests will basically reflect some or all of the examples that you discovered or articulated during your Three Amigos workshop. Does that make sense so far? Anything crazy in that? So the next question people ask is, okay, sounds good. When are we going to do this? So here's a picture that I showed yesterday, and I'll probably show again. But it's a picture of It's a picture of Scrum. And it's only here because most places are almost not doing Scrum rather than almost not doing any other agile method. So let's talk about almost not doing Scrum. The place that people typically put that Three Amigos workshop is instead of the backlog grooming. Now, backlog grooming is around here. It's probably this one, but there's nothing specific in Scrum about grooming. But it's the most Scrum implementations that I've ever seen have got a sort of grooming, one or more grooming meetings in the sprint before something gets accepted onto the backlog. And once it's on the backlog, that's you've done your analysis, essentially. So this is the place where we put the Three Amigos meeting. This is where people replace the backlog grooming, which often includes the sprint, the story point planning poker game, and they replace that with the Three Amigos. And that certainly does work. There are other ways of implementing the Three Amigos meeting, and it's really very context dependent. So is your product owner or your customer proxy sitting in your office? Are they there all the time? Can you ask them questions all the time? Well, in which case, maybe you can have lots of really small Three Amigos meeting throughout every sprint, half an hour every day, every morning. And so you're capturing little bits of conversation. Is your product owner, you work in Bath and your product owner's in London, they come down once a fortnight. Well, then you do a half day of of Three Amigos meetings. It's a similar thing as to the backlog grooming. The very best way is if you become a mature, if you feel like you're a mature Agile team, the very best way for me is to actually not do Scrum, but to take some more pull-based, lean approach to stories, where you go, these are the sort of things that we want to do, and as we pull them off of our backlog, then we run a 3 amigos for them. And that minimizes waste. You're not doing any analysis on small items until it's time for you to start work on them. But it really demands a high degree of discipline and maturity in working with user stories and working in a responsive way. So there's lots of different places you can fit it into your process. And the important thing is to understand that you have to fit it into the process you are running now. Because if there's one thing that Kanban teaches us, it's that trying to do large wholesale changes of a whole development organization like that is almost bound to fail. So it's really good to start with where you are now and make small changes and move towards where you want to go. And use this thing to help guide you. So if you make a small change and it screws things up, well, undo it and try something else. If you make a small change and it makes things better, then think about doing more of it or doing something that will complement it. And this is the feedback loop that helps us learn and implement better processes. Are there people that that have a BDD or a specification by example way of working in their organizations at the moment? And where do you do your example workshop?
Normally, as stuff goes onto the product backlog.
So before the sprint? Yeah. Okay.
Well, we don't do sprints.
Okay. Fine. So are you running a Kanban type process? Fair enough. So, it's time to talk about tools. And I'm going to talk about Cucumber first, but actually I'm talking about SpecFlow at the same time, because SpecFlow, if you look at its subtitle on its webpage, it says Cucumber for .NET. So there was a little bit of tension at one point, because Cucumber and its family products was all Aslak and his friends doing it in open source. And then a few people in Austria, as I said, and Hungary, did the .NET port, and that was, there was a discussion about whether it should be Cucumber for .NET, and Aslak didn't want that at the time, and so they called it SpecFlow and went off their own way. But that's, politics are under the bridge. So, but we're going to talk about the Cucumber family of products, because to a greater or lesser extent, SpecFlow is a port of Cucumber onto the .NET platform. Can I get a show of hands? Who has used Cucumber or SpecFlow? A few of you. Okay, so bear with me. I'm just going to, for everybody else, just to say how they work. So at the start, there are features. Features are plain text files. There are many of them, probably. Each one describes a feature of the product. They are written, as I said, in plain text files, and they should be written using the ubiquitous language, which is a language that is rooted in the business domain, that is understandable by everybody in the business, including the technical team. Within each feature, there are one or more scenarios. And scenarios is a word for an example of how the system is going to get used. So it's, you might think of it as a sort of mini use case. It's only one path through the system. So a scenario doesn't contain multiple branches. So in that way, it doesn't map well to use cases. But it is essentially about a behavior of the system within this feature set. So from one perspective, if your feature is authentication, then logging in as a registered user may be a scenario. But if the feature that you're looking at is adding something to my shopping cart or paying with a paid credit card, then logging in isn't a scenario. It's either background or precursor or a step in the scenario. Each scenario is made up of one or more steps. And so these are the lines. So you remember I showed you Chris Matz's first given, when, then scenario. Each line that starts with given or when or then is a step. So a scenario is made up of an ordered list of essentially operations or actions that are expressed in the business language. And there's a syntax. There's a very thin, lightweight syntax to this feature file, and it's called Gherkin. So, a lot of people have talked SpecFlow is now Microsoft in the Microsoft space, and in a lot of ways, its adoption has been eased by the fact that it's not called Cucumber, because people giggle about the fact that a tool is called Cucumber, and the syntax is called Gherkin, and there are other tools out there called Pickles and Relish, and so there's a meme that works fine for developers, but this is a tool that needs to be accepted by CIOs and business analysts and product owners. So to some extent, it's slightly unfortunate that it's called Cucumber and has got that whole baggage of jokes behind it. And people say, why is it called Cucumber then? And the answer is banal and pathetic. And Aslak was writing this tool, and he was sitting at home, and he said to his wife, what shall I call it? And she was eating a cucumber sandwich. And she said, why not call it Cucumber? And he's from Norway, and he said, oh, okay. But anyway, there you go, that's history. So we have a feature file or feature files in this syntax called Gherkin. And then we need some glue code. So this is in English or Dutch or Swahili or lolcats, whatever language you want to write your business specifications in. And then you have to have something that will then turn it into a call to an application that you want to write. And we call this glue code. And the glue code is made up of step definitions. So every step, as in every sentence that begins with given or when or then, has a corresponding step definition that it will cause to execute. So it's a one-to-one mapping. And the step definitions are written in the language of your tool. So with Cucumber JVM, it might be Java, or in fact Groovy, or Scala, or Clojure. In SpecFlow, it'll be C#. But essentially, there's some code that you have to write. And there's some rules about how these steps get linked up to these step definitions, and we will cover that just in a minute. And then when these get called, the step definitions invoke your application. Now, it's important to understand that Cucumber and SpecFlow, they govern this part. And what goes into the step definitions are just methods. They are just methods. You can do anything in them. And that is absolutely up to you. So SpecFlow and Cucumber do not support testing through the UI. They don't, nor do they not support testing through the UI. They are tools that invoke a method. If you use a tool that can bring up a browser and find a button and press it, such as WebDriver or Selenium, then you can test through the UI. If you want to invoke a command line application that will send an XML package to an endpoint on a service somewhere, then you can put that in here as well. So Cucumber and SpecFlow are only in this part, and so they don't support any particular sort of application testing. They facilitate any application testing that you want to do. Now, the beauty of them, because they're written in Java, because you can choose one that is written and implemented in the language of your own application, you can, in fact, also do lower-level tests that go straight into the programming API. So you can do things that are typically called unit tests or integration tests, also from these step definitions. And rather than this call being a call through a web UI or a web service endpoint, it's actually built in, and it's a compiled call to a method that has been linked in from a library. So you've got huge flexibility. Does this make sense? It's not unclear. OK. So let's have a look at these. We're going to look at these one at a time, and I'll go through some examples. So this is a feature file. So a feature file, and this is a feature file with a number of different things that I would like to describe and explain why they're there. I'll give you a really brief and shortened version of the Gherkin syntax. So there's more to Gherkin than I'm showing here. Not a lot more, but a bit more. And if you're interested in using it, it's all really well documented online. So I'm not going to waste your time to redo that. But I do need to give you a bit of a bootstrap. So the first thing is you must have the keyword feature with a colon after it. There you go. This is where you put a free-form text name for your feature. Actually, it doesn't care. Most of the implementations don't care if you have many features with the same name. So be warned. Then you can write any text you like, as much of it as you like, until you get to a keyword scenario. So basically, this is a place where you can put some extra documentation. Now, if you go online, you will see a lot of examples that have a user story in this space. As a user, I want to be able to buy something, right? If you use SpecFlow and have the Visual Studio integration, and you click through with your context menu and you say, create me a new feature file, it will create you a sample feature file with a really awful example user story for using a Polish notation calculator. And this is really bad. I think this is really bad because I don't want a user story there. There is no mapping between a feature file and a user story. User stories are small artifacts that allow us to deliver a thin increment of functionality, and as soon as we've delivered it, we throw it away. User stories are not documentation. User stories build on top of each other and invalidate the previous ones. User stories are for slicing, scheduling, managing risk. So I really abhor the fact that a lot of my colleagues still introduce basic examples with a user story up in this space. What I like putting up here are the acceptance criteria, the conditions of satisfaction that have been implemented so far. And as we develop that feature, we will increase its scope, and the conditions of satisfaction will probably grow. And at that point, you can trace it through the text up here. A word of warning, though, this is just like all documentation. It's not living documentation. This is just text. It never gets executed. It's just there as a note. So potentially, you might decide not to put anything in there at all. Whatever you do, please don't put user stories in there. And if you do decide to record your acceptance criteria there as you implement them in your feature, then you have to make sure that you keep them up to date. I'm afraid there's no good answer to that at the moment. So that's the top half, top little bit. Then we get to the keyword scenario, which says, here's one behavior that I'm interested in. So here's a scenario. The score starts at 0. And now we have a keyword given. I register a team. That's my step. Then my score is 0. So this is something that once I've been through a number of steps in the process, will be executable. I can press a button. I can see a result. It will either be red, as in it failed, green, as in it passed, or in fact, an amber, which is something went wrong, it's not finished yet. There's a slightly more complex one underneath, scenario correct, easy answer scores 10. You'll notice that there's a conjunction. Actually, you'll notice there's a when as well. So we've clearly can have given, when, then. And here we've got the word and as well. And you can also use the word but. So those are the 5 possible keywords. Given, when, then, and but. And I'm going to make I'm going to make a statement that is not strictly true, and I will tell you why it's not strictly true later. But for now, let us believe it to be true. It does not matter which word you use. Cucumber doesn't care. You could write given, 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 and Cucumber would do exactly the same. You can write and Cucumber would do exactly the same. In fact, in Cucumber, you can replace these keywords with an asterisk and make it a bullet point scenario. Right? Now, that's important because the reason these words are here is because this is supposed to be documentation. They are there so you can make it comprehensible. If you try reading it out and it sounds like gobbledygook, go back and rewrite it. This is documentation. It is supposed to be read by customers and product owners and CIOs. That is why we are using English language. If we didn't care about people reading it, let's do it in Java or C#. It's about being able to communicate to people. So, if you just type this, or let's ignore this one at the bottom just now. If you just type this into a text file, and you give the text file a .feature extension by convention, and you run Cucumber over it, it will come back with an undefined step, or in fact, 2 undefined step definitions, because you haven't defined these steps yet. And Cucumbers are a very helpful tool. It'll say, oh, I can't find any steps that match this text. Here are some snippets of what the code might look like to satisfy these steps that you have just said you want. In Ruby, it would look like this. So Ruby was the home of Cucumber, and it's also the most terse implementation, so I'll start with Ruby. This is the last Ruby slide. So it's got the given word, but as I said, it doesn't matter. If you had put when, it would say when there, but the behavior would be exactly the same. So if you try it with Ruby, you can go and edit this, turn it to when or then, and it would still behave in the same way. It then has parentheses, and in Ruby, everything between these slashes is treated as a regular expression. And you'll see so I don't know how conversant you are with regular expressions. For people who know it, I don't want to teach my grandmothers to suck eggs. And for people who don't, I don't want to blow your brains out. So I'm going to do just a few very simple things in regular expressions. This means the beginning of the line. This means the end of the line. So this regular expression will only match a step that, as its first character after the keyword is I, and then it says I register a team, and then it's a new line. So that's what this is matching. So if you go back, it matches this, and that matches it exactly. And it says, so what it's saying is, I'm going to pick up a piece of text. It picks up this piece of text. It goes into its library of regular expressions, and it says, which regular expression matches this piece of text? And when it finds one that matches, it goes, right, I'm going to execute this method. And actually, that's pretty much all Cucumber does. Now, the snippet that you get given when you run it to start with has this word pending in here. And essentially, this throws an exception, a special exception, which says, to do. I haven't done this yet. And so at that point, the step, the scenario aborts, and it gets put in a pending state. And the pending state is useful because if you're working on a scenario, some scenarios take more than 10 minutes to complete, because you have to do a lot of work actually at the implementation level. But you still want to check in every hour or so. So your continuous integration build will treat pending not as a fail. It won't blow your build up. Because essentially it's a work in progress. So there are other ways to indicate this in Cucumber, in Ruby Cucumber anyway. But essentially this is a special state. It's saying it's pending. I can tell Cucumber to treat that as a failure, but by default it treats it as, well, it broke, but it doesn't break the build. And now what we do is when we're ready to actually wire this up to our application, we throw away the pending, and we make our call to Selenium WebDriver, or we make our call to the web service endpoint. Or given that this is I register a team, maybe we do a shortcut and we have something that goes straight into the database and injects the team in and pulls back that unique ID. So we can do anything we like there. Cucumber says nothing about it. It's up to us. This is what it looks like in Ruby. In Java, it's slightly more verbose. Strange that. However, same sort of thing. We've got this given. Now it's an annotation. We now have a regular expression, but it's in quotes, so it's a string. This has some slight problems, okay? So Java, because it uses a string, within a string, it treats backslashes as an escape character. But those of you that use regular expressions will also know that backslashes have a special meaning in regular expressions. So if you need to use a regular expression term with a backslash in it, you actually have to type in 2 backslashes. So it begins to get really a little bit difficult to parse. But that's one of the pains we just live with. Then we've got public void method. Now here we're getting a clue. This is a void method. So it doesn't care what you return. In fact, in Java, you could return an int, you could return an object, you can return whatever you like. Cucumber will call a method and ignore the return value. It doesn't care. It creates a method name. Now, the method name is not important. You can change that to something that you like. It's going to throw an exception if it wants to. And to start with, it throws a new pending exception. So this is exactly analogous to the pending keyword in Ruby. As you'll see at the top, there's also an import statement, which is also necessary. So it's the same. They're the same. Essentially, we've got a regular expression. We've got the given keyword. We've got a method that is pending. Then we move on to C#. So this is the SpecFlow one. It's got a different using statement. Now we get into a little bit of technical stuff. So SpecFlow works in a different way. I'll go into some details later, but you actually need to annotate the class as well. So you'll notice that back here in the Java class, there's nothing about it. It's just a standard old class. It can be any old class. It's just looking for these Cucumber annotations. SpecFlow is slightly more troublesome in that way. And that's more to do with the .NET and Visual Studio IDE and environment. And then we have, similar to Java, now we've still got the given keyword. It's an annotation. Now the @ sign has migrated here, because now we can say this is talking about what sort of string it is. And now we can actually put backslashes in it without having to double them up, which is brilliant. And down here, pending, we don't actually throw an exception now. We talk to a global object that is provided by SpecFlow called the scenario context. And we say to the current scenario context, actually, this step is pending. And it has the same effect. So as you can see, they're all, if you know one, you know the other. So I'm now going to go to the next step. I'm going to stick with C# from now on. I apologize to anyone who's not happy with C#, but there you go. And so now I'm going to go and look at the second step, which was then my score is 0. Now, the code that Cucumber generates, or SpecFlow generates for that, looks like this. And here we're beginning to get to some of the really, the really funky stuff about Cucumber, or SpecFlow, or both of them. So regular expression. These parentheses are indicating a capture group. That is, I want to take whatever matches in these parentheses, and I'm going to use it for something. The dot means any character, and the star means 0 or more of them. So in this particular case, you remember the wording was, then my score is 0. That will match to the 0. So what Cucumber has done is it's captured a 0. The snippet that it generates, it's still a public void method, but now it's got an integer parameter. And that integer parameter, it's really clever. In fact, the snippets, you think they're really clever until you realize they're not really clever. So there are two things that the snippets will generate. It can recognize a number. Actually, it recognizes an integer. It puts in this format for every integer it finds, and it then sticks an integer parameter onto the generated snippet method. So there has to be a match of, for every capture group in the regular expression, there has to be exactly one parameter, formal parameters of the method. If the regular expression has double quotes in it, SpecFlow and Cucumber go, it's a string. And so it'll give you a string type. If it finds that it's got an integer, it'll give you an integer type. That's all it'll do. After that, you're on your own. So if you write, then my score is 5.5, it will send you two integers, a 5 and a 5. It doesn't recognize floats. It's not a big deal, because at that point, we have to realize a few things. So first off, this is a snippet that has been generated to help you, but you don't need to use it. And if you do use it, you're free to change it. So first off, P0 is not the most meaningful method, parameter name that has ever been thought of. So go in and change it to reflect what it is that parameter is trying to communicate. And then dot star, really? I would replace it with a digit. Here, because it's in C# with this lovely thing here, I only need a single backslash. In Java, you would need a double backslash. And now, because this is a then, this is your assert part of your arrange, act, assert trilogy or triumvirate. And here I'm just going to use absolutely bog standard NUnit. And it's important this is how Cucumber reports failures. So pending says it's pending. Anything that throws no exception is a pass. And anything that throws an exception is a fail. All of the common XUnit frameworks throw exceptions to signal a failure. And so it meshes in really nicely with all of those. But that's the thing that signals a failure. An uncaught exception that isn't a pending exception is a failure. Everything else is a pass. And there's a bundle of different outcomes for a step. And actually, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to go through these. The slides will be available. And for each set of step outcomes, there's scenario outcomes. And now we're down in the details. So let's ignore those. They're all there. So I promised to talk about the differences between Cucumber and SpecFlow, because there are some. Some of them are significant. And I'd like to, at least to leave you with those. So the first is they're managed by different teams. So the Cucumber team works together. You know, there's one open source project. It's one team. Different people work on different language implementations, but we all work together on GitHub. techtalk is also open source, but it's very much sponsored by, well, it's actually SpecFlow is sponsored by techtalk, which is an Austrian consultancy company. There's a difference between the given, when, then. So you recall I said that given, when, and then were entirely interchangeable. That's absolutely true, except in SpecFlow, when they're absolutely not interchangeable. So in SpecFlow, given, when, and then are in distinct namespaces. What that means is that if you say given I register, that will match a very different, that will only match a given annotation, that given I register. And a when I register will only match a when I register. There are no namespaces for and or but. And or but bind to the most recent namespace above it. So if you say given I register and I go to the home page, that and is treated as a given, and it will generate a given binding. They have got compatibility, so you can go in and modify the annotations and delete all the givens, whens, thens, and replace them with step definition. And now it behaves like Cucumber. So the step definition binding says, I want to work in a global namespace where given, when, and then are entirely interchangeable. And I recommend you do this. As far as I know, the SpecFlow Visual Studio integration does not allow you to set that as a default, which I think is it was a shame. So that's the first major difference. Secondly, there's stuff about binding and test frameworks. So in all of the Cucumber implementations, it basically just works. As long as the Cucumber knows where your feature files are, and in some cases you need to either put your step definitions in a known place in a hierarchy, or you can pass to Cucumber the place that you have put your step definitions. Everything else then just works. There's a choice of plugins that you can use if you want to integrate with, if you want to get full output, if you want to get HTML output, if you want to get JUnit style output so you can plug it into a continuous integration build, you can choose which plugins you use. So there's some configuration on the actual format of the output that it uses. But in general, it just works, and you can tweak it really easily. SpecFlow, because it lives in the Visual Studio, .NET, everything has to be complicated world, is complicated. So every feature file generates, of course, code behind, because why wouldn't you? So every feature file's got a C# file, and if you want to do things on the command line, you have to know the right invocations, and they use Visual Studio project files to work out where. So you're completely immersed in the .NET world. By default, SpecFlow uses NUnit, because, of course, we're going to do a plugin for Visual Studio, which is in the Microsoft space, so we're going to use NUnit, because no one in Visual Studio land uses Microsoft Test, do they? So if you want to use MS Test, as so many people do, you have to jump through a couple of hoops. And those hoops are well documented online, but they're painful. You have to put your specs in a different sort of project. So in unit, you have to do a class library project. If you're going to do an MS Test, you have to do it in a unit test project. It's just stuff you have to know. If you're going to do it in MS Test, you have to go in and edit the app.config file and put in a special property. It's just stuff you have to know. But once you've done that, it all works fine. And you have output options as well that allow you to plug it into, output as like HTML, and allow you to put it into a continuous integration build. Now, I haven't shown you complexity. We're just skimming the surface of stuff. But you can imagine that as soon as you start getting a a large set of steps, you aren't going to want them all to be in the same file. Your steps and your step definitions, you're going to want to structure them in some way. And the way that we recommend you structure them, the way we found to be best, is that your feature files are, as the name sounds, organized by feature, as the capability that you're using in the system. But your step definitions, we found it's much better, much more maintainable, much more easy to navigate if you organize them by domain concept. So you have a file of step definitions that, for instance, deal with user registration. You've got a pile of step definitions that deal with scoring, a pile of step definitions that deal with games, that deal with prizes. So we're dealing domain concepts. And then what you find is that a lot of different features make use of steps from a single domain concept, and a single feature will make use of steps that touch a lot of domain features. So you get a many-to-many relationship, because that's the nature of features. They don't, generally a feature isn't constrained by a single domain concept. And now when you've got multiple step definition files, you somehow have to share data between them. So if you log in as a user, you might want to change the username. So you need to know what the username was. So you need to share data. And now we're getting to the point of how we're going to transfer data in a manageable way that preserves isolation between different step definition files. Now we're in technical land here. In Ruby, Cucumber has what it's called the world object. It's just a well-known context object, and at the beginning of each scenario, you get a new one. And then you can just add stuff to it, and wherever you are in whichever step definition file, you go to it and you say, have you got a username in this world? And I'll use that. So you share by essentially a context-based global object. In Java, we use dependency injection, and there are bindings to 4 or 5 of the most popular dependency injection frameworks, and it allows us, again, to manage things so that at the beginning of each scenario, we start off with a fresh context, so there's no leakage between our different scenarios or different examples. But because we're using dependency injection, we can break it down. We don't have one massive world object. We can have separate context objects that deal with separate concerns. And so if your step definition doesn't need to know anything about the login details, well, you just don't ask that to be injected. So you can get much better, much more focused, much more encapsulated step definitions that don't know too many things. Actually, SpecFlow does both. SpecFlow was thrown in the kitchen sink, so you can inject stuff. It's got scenario-level context object. It's got a feature-level context object. So it's got different lifespans, life cycles. There's another thing called hooks. I'm going to skim over this really quickly. Hooks are not evidenced in the feature file. So these are things that we use at the implementation level to do stuff that we don't think our customer or product owner needs to know about. So this might be spin up a web server in the background, or clear down a database so we start from a fresh point, or inject a whole bundle of reference data in. In Cucumber, there are 2 steps. It's before and after. And that's before a scenario starts, so you can get a scenario to known state, and after, so you can clean up at the end of a scenario. Ruby's got another couple I'm not going to talk about at all. As I said, SpecFlow kitchen sink. You can run hooks before or after all tests run, before and after feature runs, before and after a scenario runs, before and after each particular step runs. And in fact, they even have this concept of scenario block, which is the given, the when, and the then. So, hey, knock yourself out. So actually, let's stop there for a second. That's me stopping comparing Cucumber and SpecFlow. Does anyone have it? Did anyone bring any specific questions about the differences between the two? No. Okay. Right. Myths. The feature file is a great place to document examples. It's a great place to document what a feature does. I think it's a great place also to document what acceptance criteria have been satisfied by those examples. It is not the only documentation you will need. So this is not, so people go, where are we going to put the wireframes? So I don't know, where do you put the wireframes today? So we keep on using the same sort of documentation technology. If you have to have an installation manual, you still need an installation manual. If you want to have something that talks about the copyright, you have copyright. If you need wireframes or user journeys or customer experience statements, you will still need to document that. However, as your system grows, your features will contain a lot of the system and user level documentation about how the system behaves, what you can do with it. And at that point, you need to structure things. So these are purely text files. And these text files can be arranged hierarchically on your file system. And the way I like thinking about it is exactly like a user manual, where you've got sections 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you have subsections 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And what I try and do is I try and collect large, high-level descriptions or behaviors in the top level. So about logging in, about buying products, about adding inventory. And then maybe in 1.1 or 1.2, I'll be talking about what are the valid usernames or what are the password rules. In 2.1 or 2.2, I'll be talking about what sort of ID codes can I have? What prices am I allowed? Am I allowed to have items that weigh 0 kilograms? And so we get into the detailed stuff. And that way, we can generate structured HTMLized documents that you can click through and see what's been implemented. And at the top level, you get to find out, you get a feeling for the feature, for the capability. If you want to drill down into username rules, or if you want to drill down into product rules, then you go to a lower level. And that way, it keeps your documentation partitioned, and it means that people who need to find out what the system does can get there quickly and efficiently. I want to go back to this, though, which is around the ideas about user stories, acceptance criteria, and examples. So these are the things that come out of the Three Amigos workshop, and this is the feature file that we saw earlier, maybe slightly extended. And people often ask, well, do I have to put this into TFS? Where do these go in Jira? What about that? So my answer is, I'd prefer you not to use TFS or Jira and keep it all on cards if you could possibly do so. And the reason is this. You come out of the Three Amigos meeting with all of these cards filled out for one or more stories. The examples, you code straight up as scenarios. Each of those concrete examples gets recorded as a scenario that you are going to want to execute. So we throw away the examples because we've got them written down and checked into source control. The acceptance criteria, as I said, I like putting in the preamble, in the documentation at the top. So it's recorded. Goodbye acceptance criteria. The user story, where's the user story? Well, I've already given the game away. I don't believe that we should have the user story anymore. The user story is about delivering that functionality, and as soon as it's delivered, chuck it in the trash can. Done. The next myth is that we don't need testers anymore. Did everyone catch that? Because I like it so much, I'm going to do it again. Good. OK. So we do need testers, right? So Julie, I know, works in the test space. We're not trying to get rid of testers. So this is the diagram that I want to use to demonstrate why we still need testers. So this is my reworking of the testing pyramid. And all of this pyramid, all of this triangle is automation, or at least potentially automatable. But we absolutely mustn't forget that we can only automate so much. And there's stuff that is not worth automating because it's too complex, it's not cost effective. And even if we could automate it, we still need the skills of testers to try and find out what it was we'd forgotten, because until it's actually up there running, it's really difficult to know about. So we need testers to do exploratory and manual work. But equally, I refer you to some work by Lisa Christman and Janet Gregory around the agile testing quadrants. So the stuff that we've been talking about are all sitting in here. They're automated stuff that's business-facing, and it supports the team. The things that the developers are doing are down here. They're automated, they're technology-facing, supporting the team. This is automatable. There's a whole bundle of stuff over here that we need people, specialists, with expertise to maintain and manage. And this is where we really get value out of testers. And let's not forget also that we needed the testers in the room when we were doing the Three Amigos workshop, because they have that experience of what breaks that we happen, as developers, we often like to forget about. So those are the books. There's another myth around, actually, because this is automation, it's a test role. So we can do the Three Amigos workshop, and then it comes with examples, and then everything after that, the testers can do. They can write the scenarios, they can do the automation, they can do the ubiquitous language. And that's absolutely not right, okay? So, I didn't take away the animation there. So the way it works is that actually, this is a development task. That doesn't mean that testers can't work in that space too, but you need development skills because A, you're writing code, and B, you're needing to structure it. Those are, by definition, skills of developers. So you've seen a role come to exist over the past 10 years called a DIT, or developer in test. And that's a role of someone who has got development skills and test skills. But if you leave this, and I'm not being rude about the our test colleagues. Testing is important, and testing is a skill, but it's not the same skill as removing repetition, structuring modules, making sure that methods are named nicely. Just have to look in your local HP Quality Center manual test script repository to verify that that's the case. The other thing is, these step definitions should be really small. So I haven't gone into any detail about them, but they shouldn't be creating 27,000 mocks and then jumping through half a dozen web pages clicking on buttons. All of that needs to be factored out into a well-structured support code, reusable components. So back to the question that you asked about login. So logging in, at one place, you need to be able to log in and make sure that the UI works correctly and it wires up to the right back-end services. And at another point, you want to be able to log in and get to a checkout page with a random item in your basket with one sentence, with one method call. And that gets coded up into support code. And this needs to be structured well. This is basic frameworks that you as a development organization will need to go through and develop to support your domain. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with test methods, scenarios rather than step definitions that are pages long, at which point they become really difficult to maintain. So we need testers, but we also need to accept that the things that you might traditionally thought this is test automation and therefore it's not my job, it's a tester's job. No, whoever does that needs to have test and development skills. It's a really great place for testers and developers to pair up, and they both get upskilled. And you can move towards that cross-functional team that Scrum says you've already got. And I'm just going to generalize this. So it's not even that testers, it's not even a myth that just testers will write the scenarios. It's a myth that any single role will write the scenarios. The scenarios express your ubiquitous language, and your ubiquitous language is owned by the team. If everybody in the team doesn't understand the ubiquitous language, it's not ubiquitous. More is not necessarily better. So we do not want to do exhaustive testing of every path through the system. A lot of the functionality of the system should be verified by low-level tests, hence that pyramid that I showed earlier. That's why we have a foundation of really small tests that execute small parts of the application. And as we build this application together, we write slightly larger tests that exercise the interactions between those small bits that we already think work correctly. So as we get higher and higher up, we're testing the protocols and interactions between our subsystems, between our components that we've already verified that they work in isolation. And then as we get higher up, typically these behavioral tests that we write in the ubiquitous language so that our customers can understand them, they are normally quite coarsely grained behaviors. They're not about what does this little class do down here. They're normally about part of a business process, like checking out or making sure that the postage is increased correctly if you're sending it to the Scottish Islands or something like that. These are things that your business can talk about. And at that level, we don't want to check. You don't want to check that every different postcode gets the right postage, right? You use test skills such as equivalence partitioning to say, look, if it begins with EH46, it doesn't. And if it begins with EH64, then it does. And you can then do some equivalence partitioning about, well, what does that mean? So is it a Highland postcode or is it a Lowland postcode? And so we don't want massive numbers of scenarios. Because if it's not addressing a risk, then why are we writing it? Because every test takes time to run, and every test has to be maintained. So it costs. And if it doesn't give us any return, which means, in my book, it means reducing the risk of our next system being bug-filled, then I don't want to write it, and I don't want to maintain it. So at this point, I'm going to appeal to a higher authority. Kent Beck, the father of test-driven development, said, I get paid for code that works, not for tests. So my philosophy, and this is the guy who invented test-driven development, folks. This is the guy who invented XP. This is your Uber developer. He says, my philosophy is to test as little as possible to reach a given level of confidence. We're talking about addressing risk. So, depends where you're working. If you're working on airplane control systems or medical life support systems, then I am guessing that your level of confidence is going to have to be really quite high. If you're writing a little website that maintains bookings for your local golf club, maybe not so high. So it's about addressing risk. This lovely photograph is of an old-style tent. Does anyone have a tent? Not this sort, but anyone got a tent? Okay. Most of them now come with really bendy poles, don't they? And you put them in, they pop up, and they just stand up. Yeah? Are yours like that? Do they still have guy ropes on them?
Yes.
Yes. Do you use them?
No.
No. Why don't you use them?
Well, might use them.
Why do you not normally use them?
Because the weather's all right.
You don't go camping in the winter unless you live in Scotland, in which case you do. And in fact, you need it in the summer. But anyway, the point is, tests are like guy ropes. You put out as many guy ropes as you think you need based on the weather. That's your appreciation of the risk of the system. So if you're on the west coast of Skye, you put out your guy ropes. If you're going to Glastonbury, probably not. Actually, maybe possibly, actually, you do. So anyway, so it's a nice analogy. Think of your tests as guy ropes holding your application tent up. Another myth, that the scenarios should be really, really detailed. No. Scenarios, so the critical point of this whole process, once you get to the level of writing scenarios, is that you keep your customer and product owner engaged. So if you write scenarios, and then nobody ever reads them apart from the developers and testers, you are missing out on that ubiquitous language. You are missing out on the feedback loop of, no, you've misunderstood what the business value of this is. You've got it wrong. So if you have lots and lots of really finely grained imperative scenarios with lots of details, I will guarantee you your product owner will very quickly stop reading your feature files. And at that point, you have lost all of the feedback, and you've lost a huge amount of the benefit that this whole approach will give you. At the other end of the scale, there is declarative, which means identifying the domain abstractions, the business concepts that your product owner understands and engages with, and using them in your scenarios to describe what's happening. So here's a very quick example to demonstrate it. Here is a sign-up page. Now, this level of detail may be necessary somewhere in your set of, in your feature files, on a detailed level about what fields are necessary to sign up for a new account. But this is that feature. This scenario is about where you get redirected to when you have created a new account. And at that point, that means that we are repeating a whole bundle of stuff about signing up that has already been defined somewhere else. And we're going to be reading this over and over again. And I contend that even developers and testers will glaze over if they have to read 10 like that. And if you change one of them, you probably won't notice that the other 9 are different. So I suggest that this is a better way of expressing that particular scenario, which is instead of all that detail about entering fields, clicking links, pressing buttons, you identify the domain constraint, the domain concept, which is I am signing up for a new account. And at this point, because we're testing where you get forwarded to and that you see a greeting message, you are not concerned, and when I say you, I mean you, your customer, your testers, are not concerned about what your username was, or whether you put in passwords correctly, or whether you click links. They just want to know that when you have successfully signed up, you're going to get to the right page and see the message. Yeah?
Is that a sub-scenario? Is that just a scenario? When I sign up and
Yeah. So that's a good point. It's just a scenario. So the thing is, if you don't think you need to set up a context, then don't set up a context. So signing up, this again, it's domain language. So if you sit down in your Three Amigos workshop and people go, I don't understand this, no, I want a given, I want some sort of context, then that's fine. We actually had this discussion yesterday, didn't we, or Monday? So here, potentially what you would say is, given I am not logged in when I sign up for a new account, then I should be taken to my feeds page. So the action is signing up for a new account. And you may say that it's an assumption that everyone will understand that if you're signing up for a new account, you can't be logged in because there's no sign up button if you're logged in. Or you may want to make it explicit. But it's not a sub-scenario. It's a scenario. And there's another blog post about identifying domain concerns. And if you find yourself unable to express it succinctly in a one-liner, it's possible that you haven't yet identified the domain concern. There's something lurking there that you can abstract away. So, almost on time. BDD is an approach that builds on agile practices. It's not a test automation activity, although test automation is a side effect that you can get from it. Tools are wonderful. I work with the Cucumber tool. I've written a book about the Cucumber tool. I love using the Cucumber tool. But BDD is not about the Cucumber tool, the Fit tool, the SpecFlow tool. It's not about tools. But the tools can make your life really easy, and they can promote that living documentation to a point at which it can be really useful for interacting with your business. So I recommend you go to a website called relishapp.com and go to the public projects and search for GDS, Government Digital Services. Government Digital Services wrote Cucumber scripts, published them in public, and they are there for you to read. Not all of them are wonderful, but it demonstrates HTMLized, example-based documentation of what the government digital services delivered. And civil service is not famed for being at the bleeding edge. And finally, there is no silver bullet. This does not mean your life suddenly, you can sit around, you can fire your testers, or you don't have to write any code, or your BAs will do your specifications for you. This is just a tool. It's an approach that emphasizes collaboration, which tries to force you to uncover your hidden assumptions early on in the process, articulate them, write them down in a way that everybody understands so you can get feedback and everybody can contribute, and then make it easy to automate them so that your documentation can stay up to date. It's not a silver bullet. And in fact, there never will be a silver bullet. So whenever you find yourself saying everything's going to be easy because of this tool, this approach, or this method, that's the book that you've all got to go and buy.
Are you going to become rich and famous?
Yeah, right. That's my test. That's the discount code to make sure that I don't become rich and famous. I tweet on, strangely, I tweet on Twitter. I don't tweet very much. I try and tweet interesting things rather than what cups of coffee I'm drinking. I do blog on the Claysnow website. Feel free to go and have a look. If you like it, then feel free to subscribe. Also, if you go home back to your place of work and you want to try any of these things out and you have questions or problems, if you've got scenarios that you're generating at work and you're going, you know, I'd really like to get a second opinion on these, I'm more than happy to answer your emails. You know, so as I was saying to the folk on Monday, I offer a lifetime support. You only have to come to one of my talks and get my email, and I offer lifetime support. obviously I've got ulterior motives. I want to take your money eventually. But feel free to use me. Send me emails, ask me questions. And in fact, I'm going to be standing at this desk for the next 15 minutes, so you can come and ask me questions now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you around. To JBehave just to demonstrate it to Chris Matz, and a big pain was paid, a large cost was paid for that. We'll hear about that later. Then around 2004, JBehave was beginning to take shape, and Chris Matz and Dan started, instead of just using the word should, they started writing their stories, as they were called in JBehave. They wrote their stories in a text file so that they could be authored and worked on by business analysts and customers and product owners, not just developers who had access to the source control. And this blog post from 2005 on Chris's blog of the time is possibly the first outing for this story format, which uses that given, when, then format, which we'll come back to in a while. In around, I think it was 2005, Uncle Bob, Robert Martin, who another signatory of the Agile Manifesto, put a web front end on top of Fit, the tool that Ward Cunningham had done, thus making the specifications, the business readable specifications, even more accessible to the business, because now they were hosted on a web server. And so the business didn't need to use any special editors or tools. They could just go to an HTML browser and click through their specifications, see what had passed, see what had failed, and in fact, even by clicking the run button, see all of their specifications run against a test installation. So here we're beginning to see the first sort of outing for living documentation actually in the hands of the customer, being able to see the stuff that you guys are delivering working as they've specified. Time moves on. Chris and his team of Olaf Maassen and some other contributors started thinking about other ways of working, other ways of getting feedback quickly, and other ways of trying to defer decisions until later. And the two terms that he came up with were feature injection, which is essentially about delaying putting things into the product until it's been shown that you need it, and real options, which is trying to model some of those decision makings in terms of the financial market. And so options are basically, you have a choice to do something. And the idea about an option is that it gives you some flexibility. You have to understand with options, both in software and in financial terms, when do they expire, how much cost is there to actually keep that option alive, and you only make a decision when it comes to a point where the option is either going to expire or become too expensive. So this book is it's actually a graphic novel. I'm more into thinking about them as documentation of the code and a way of probing into the behavior of the code that you want to write. So here we're still back in 2002, 13 years ago. At the same time in the States, Ward Cunningham, who is one of the original Agile Manifesto signatories, and also you may have known him as the person who invented the wiki, started working on Fit, which was, as it says here, the framework for integrated tests. So this is another automation tool which was trying to put the specification of those tests into the business domain into a documentation form. Then Chris Matz moved on to work with another colleague, and he started thinking about, well, a lot of these assumptions that we get that when we go out gathering requirements, we really only find out that we were wrong about our understanding when the developers try working on it, and they then come and ask us a question which challenges the assumptions that we had when we were listening, when we were talking. So he started working with a process that he called break the model. And what that was trying to think of examples of how this requirement would actually be implemented in practice, thinking about concrete ways or examples of how it would be used, and using that to break his understanding, to challenge his assumption, to see if there are other assumptions that he needed to surface. Dan North, at the same time, was writing this JBehave tool and trying to verify behavior and getting the vocabulary together. And this is a direct descent of domain-driven design from Eric Evans and his ubiquitous language of the late 90s. Ooh. And then, as these things go, both Chris and Dan happened to be talking at the Agile Development Conference in the States and sat next to each other on the way back on the plane and chatted through what they had been doing and what they had discovered. And they decided that there was something about this word should, about writing these things as documentation, about using examples to challenge your assumptions that was really powerful. And they worked together then for a wee while on JBehave. And JBehave, well, the story that Chris Matz tells anyway is that he's a business analyst, not a developer. So he was sitting with Dan, they were talking about these high-level concepts, and Dan was trying to build a tool. And he mentioned the visitor pattern. Anyone heard of the visitor pattern? A few people. Okay. So it's one of the standard patterns that comes out of the design pattern book by the four gurus. And it's quite funky and it's quite useful in some languages, but it is quite slippery to get your head around. So Dan put that into... Hello? Sorry, I thought it wasn't time to start yet, so I was having a conversation. I apologize. So hello, I'm going to talk about behavior-driven development, and specifically I'm going to talk about how to try and fit behavior-driven development into the processes of where you work. I'll be talking about, I will be mentioning these tools, Cucumber and SpecFlow, as we go through. I won't be dwelling on them, and you'll find out why I won't be dwelling on them for 100% of this presentation. But when I do get to tooling, it will be the Cucumber family of tools that I'll be talking about, not other ones like BDFi or Fitness. So I think it's best that we start off with a slide that says what BDD is. So this is what BDD is. Straightforward, clear, obvious in a lot of ways. So I'm still not sure. I'm quite a good friend of Dan North's, and I still haven't quite found out whether he said this as a joke or whether he was actually serious. But we'll come back to this. But there's some interesting things that I think is important to see. And one is that it's part of an agile methodology. So does everybody here work in an agile way? Do you think? I'm not, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, because agile is just a way of being responsive to change. So I'm going to take us through very quickly, or at least reasonably quickly, a brief history of the universe of software development until today. So there's my slide, introducing history. This is where I would like to start. This is from the Royce paper of 1970. This is where waterfall became acceptable. So this is the slide that people didn't read. This was on page 2. The slide that was on page 1 was exactly the same, but it didn't show any of the back arrows. And so that's where waterfall really came from. If you'd read to page 2, you'd have discovered that Royce wasn't advocating waterfall. He was advocating a process where you had feedback at every step. Strangely enough, this didn't work very well. So if anyone who's at Alan Holub's keynote on Tuesday will have heard him talk about the chaos report from Standish. And if you go back and look at some of the work from Caspar Jones from earlier even in the end of last century, you'll see that vast numbers of projects failed. And so over the years, people tried to find other ways of developing projects and developing them successfully. One of the earliest methods has almost been forgotten. It's still being championed by the customer proxy to sit with the team all week and look at things as they got delivered. Scrum talks about delivering and doing a sprint demo every 2 to 4 weeks. And other methods fall somewhere in between. But when you compare it to 6 months or a year or 2 years, 2 to 4 weeks is miraculous. And there are still organizations around the world who have adopted agile methods and specifically Scrum, and I think that being able to deliver once every 3 months and get some feedback is really quick. So, it's all about just trying to accelerate that feedback and that learning cycle. At the same time, there was a really vibrant scene here in London. So Chris Matz, who was a business coach, started working with, he picked up some of the concepts from XP, which was really strong on pair programming. And as a business analyst, he started doing pair analysis and found that having 2 people talking about things was much more productive than sitting there scratching your head and then every week batching up questions and sending them off in an email and waiting for a response. Dan North at the same time was working at a lower level, trying to teach people to do test-driven development and adopt other agile practices that came from the XP family. And he discovered that it was really hard. As soon as you started saying to developers, you have to put the word test into the name of your method if you want it to be run by a unit test framework, they started thinking about it as a white box implementation-based test. They started thinking about it in a way that was that caused you to write poorly structured and hard to maintain tests. And so his first thought was he used something called, I can't remember what it's called, DocsGen or something like that, which actually pulled out the names of the methods of the tests and printed them out so you could read them as if it was documentation. And at that point, he started to encourage people to write the names of their unit test methods as sentences that could be interpreted. Unfortunately, he was using an early version of JUnit in Java before it had annotations, and so one of the limitations of JUnit back then was your methods had to have the word test in them, otherwise JUnit didn't realize they were a test. And so then he went on in his first version of JBehave, which was the tool that he started working on, replaced that word test with the word should. And so now you had sentences that had the word should in it, and he saw a really big change in the way developers responded to that, because they were thinking about, well, should it do that? Should it always do that? Are there some cases where it should do something else? And so it began to move developers away from thinking about unit tests as tests. Tom Gilb, the inventor, and it's called Evo. And so that was probably the first lightweight methodology which he started working on in the mid-80s. And then quite a few other ones came in. So these are the famous ones: Scrum, DSDM, Crystal from Alistair Coburn, and XP. And as you can see, these all started coming around in the 90s. This was when people were having major problems delivering software projects, and a lot of it was attributed to the fact that there's huge upfront design phase, and by the time the customer saw what you were doing, it might be months or years later, requirements would have changed, misunderstandings would have got amplified, people were unhappy. And so these folks, these consultants, these generally single-person consultants, were being called in, and they were trying to bootstrap processes that were lightweight, that allowed feedback to come through quickly, allowed people to respond to feedback about this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. Just to be clear, so this is 1995 we're talking about Scrum. Scrum has a bit of a checkered past, and it then split off into two separate Scrums. It's almost like a rugby match now. And so we have two competing organizations. So if you're certified by one, you're not certified by the other. So be careful. Then these guys, who represent a lot of those methods that I showed on the previous slide, came together in 2001 and said, look, we're all doing something pretty much similar. We're in the same sort of space. And they got together in Snowbird for a skiing holiday, and at the same time came up with the Agile Manifesto. And that's where the history of these methods being called Agile started. For a lot of that weekend, they couldn't agree on anything, even which pistes to go skiing on. And then they realized at the end that they had to come up with something. And the manifesto, if you've read it, is pretty thin. It just expresses some values. And then on the back page, they've got 12 principles. But it gave a framework for people to then move on and say that we are working with an agile way of working. We're working in an agile way. Agile, however, is an adjective. It's to describe how we work, what sort of properties we want our process to have. We want to be responsive. We want to be able to be flexible. It's not a noun. It's not about you must do it this way. And hence the very light nature of the Agile Manifesto. The whole point of all of these methods was to try and get feedback quickly, so that if we'd made a mistake, if we'd misunderstood something, if the business had changed its needs, we could respond to that quickly. We wanted to get things in front of the customer on a regular basis. So XP, which was started in the Chrysler C3 project in the 90s, wanted to get the customer